Welcome to this session. My name is Barbara Bochalia, and today we are going to look at, in this class, we are going to look at human resource planning. Human resource planning. In our previous class, we saw, we looked at recruitment and selection, and actually human resource planning precedes recruitment and selection, right? So even before we do the recruitment and selection, it is important. It actually, human resource planning comes before the recruitment and the selection. So human resource planning, to be precise, means an organization moving from its current position of current human resource position to the desired human resource position. In other words, it involves an organization getting an organization putting it into account, right? Or thinking ahead, actually thinking ahead in terms of its human resource needs. Thinking ahead in terms of its human resource needs. Or you can simply say it is a process where management will determine on how the organization moves from its current manpower position to its desired manpower position, whereby it will target, work towards, or strive towards having the right people, the right number of people, and doing the right kinds of tasks in the right place and in the right time to be able to achieve organizational goals. So human resource planning has four basic what I should call it, the process of human resource planning. It is categorized into four phases. It is categorized into four phases, where the first phase involves gathering and analyzing of data through manpower inventories and forecasts. Right? So the very first step of human resource planning is to gather and analyze data through manpower inventories and forecasts. Then secondly, it consists of establishing manpower objectives and policies, right? In other words, what is that reason that the organization is planning, is thinking ahead of human resource needs, right? Then the third phase will involve designing and implementing plans, promotions to enable the organization achieve its manpower objectives, right? So the third stage will basically involve what we call drawing a blueprint, right? Developing that blueprint. And then lastly, it will be basically about controlling and evaluation, right? Whereby the organization will be looking at whether the intended goals are achieved or not, right? Evaluation, right? Whether the organization has achieved its intended goals in terms of the human resource needs that are planned for. What are the objectives of human resource planning? These ones are summarized below. Number one, it helps, it is aimed at forecasting the human resource requirements, right? Forecasting is, to forecast is, what can I use it for? For example, when you say your weather forecasting, weather forecast, you are expecting maybe
predict
the weather to be sunny, that kind of thing, a forecast. So basically you are thinking the expectations you have for the future, right? In terms of human resource planning. Then of course, then it is aimed at effective management of change. We realize that over time, these organizations change management, right? These organizations are purchased, they merge, what you call mergers, and the acquisitions, for example, change of management, they could even diversify, right? Where they are now diversifying into a different kind of business, they are expanding. So all those require human resource planning, where in some cases it involves recruiting more staff. Yeah, it may involve recruiting more staff, right? Then it helps to realize the organization goals. Of course, at the end of the day, when you plan, and at the end of the day you recruit the right people, you'll be able to, these people will be able to contribute towards the performance of an organization. Of course, if it's profit maximization, it will help in reducing costs and maximizing profits. It helps to promote employees. So we are going to see that the human resource planning, the businesses do plan. For example, if it's retirement, if it requires promotion, then of course the promotion might come because maybe someone has left the organization, someone has retired, and then someone gets a chance of being promoted, right? And then effective utilization of human resource. Of course, at the end of the day, if the organization is getting the rightful skilled people to do the rightful jobs or positions, to fill the rightful positions, then that is effective utilization of human resource. So what are the needs for human resource planning? Or what are the major reasons for emphasis on human resource planning at macro level? Of course, when we talk about macro level, we are looking at it at a broader perspective at national level, right? So one of the reasons for the need for human resource planning is the employment and unemployment situation, right? So in terms of unemployment situation, of course, when we plan for human resource planning, at the end of the day, we know that at the end of the day, the organization may have a need to, for example, to recruit. And when they recruit, of course, we know that this reduces on the unemployment, right? And then technological change. Of course, we see that with the ever-changing technology, where the world is, where we are heading, technology is changing over time. And of course, if there is change in technology, even the workers or the employees that have those relevant skills have to be recruited by these organizations. And then the organizational change, we've seen that the turbulence environment where we see fluctuations, right? For example, it could require that not only recruiting, but also it may require that the organization does not even need to recruit because it is becoming costly for it. we saw what happened in the first lockdown and the second lockdown. People were losing jobs, right? Because the economic condition was worsening because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and actually it has affected organizations economically, not only here but worldwide, where economies have been grappling with the disease or with the pandemic. So we could also have change in terms of change in management, where maybe the organization merges with another organization, where maybe we have acquisitions, where the organization has been taken on by different management, and these ones require maybe to recruit different workers. Demographic change. Demographic change here, we are looking at it in terms of age, sex, literacy levels, the technical skills, and the social backgrounds. So if we are looking at it, for example, in the perspective of age, we know that different countries, they have different labor policies, retirement age. For example, if the retirement age reaches and people are aging within an organization, then definitely it means the organization has to think ahead in terms of the human resource needs. So as people are aging, they are almost reaching retirement age, the business or the organization should be thinking ahead on when to recruit more people to replace these employees that are soon retiring, right? Then it could be in terms of sex, where we see that different countries have different labor policies, where we see equal opportunity, where they want equal opportunities in terms of employment. You have to employ a certain percentage of females, that kind of thing. Then literacy levels, of course, here we look at the education levels and education qualifications and the technical skills practically that are needed by these organizations. Skill shortage. So we realize that if, for example, we may have very many educated citizens in a nation, but it's one thing to be educated and it's another to be skilled, isn't it? It's one thing to be educated and it's another to be skilled. So we can have very many educated citizens, but who don't have the skills that are required by this organization, right? So it's very important that much as we are having these papers, we develop ourselves in terms of getting the relevant skills that are needed in the job market, right? So here, some employers may not be really looking for the papers, but they will be looking for the skills on top of the academic qualifications. Government influences, where we see that governments have different labor laws, labor legislations, and how they control this kind of working conditions, where they are putting restrictions on women, and maybe some countries put restrictions on women to work, to do some kind of jobs, where some countries have strict restrictions on child employment, and others also have strict labor legislations on casual and contractual labor. So all these will determine the human resource planning process. Legislative control, of course, this has to do with laws, the labor laws, where they also have a lot to do. So the legislations, the government and the legislations work hand in hand, right? Of course, if the government is in support of those legislations, then they would take an upper hand in determining the human resource planning process, right? Then also we are still looking at the need for human resource planning and the impact of pressure groups. So different pressure groups like labor unions, politicians, those ones, in most cases, they are agitating for better working conditions. They are agitating for employment being provided for the unemployed in the country. So all those ones will also have an upper hand in influencing the human resource planning for organizations or businesses. So let us look at the approaches to human resource planning. The approaches to human resource planning. So with these approaches, we basically have 3 approaches to human resource planning. We have, of course, here we are looking at the very first thing we should know here is that we should look at education as a consumption good, and we should also look at education as an investment, and we should also look at education in terms of the rate of return, as a rate of return, that education has a rate of return on investment. That when you invest in education, there is that rate of return that is attained by investing in education. So in terms of approaches to educational planning, of course, now here we are looking at it in the perspective, we are looking at human resource planning in the perspective of educational planning. So we basically have 3 approaches to education planning. We have the social demand approach, the rate of return approach, and the manpower requirement approaches to education planning. So we have the social demand approach. Now with the social demand approach here, of course, we are looking at it in the perspective of education planning, right? The social demand approach looks at education as a good that is demanded by individuals, right? So education, it looks at education as any other good or service that is demanded by education, right? And of course, the demand for education will be determined by a number of factors. And what are those factors that determine the demand for education? Number 1 is the income level, the income of educated people. Of course, we know that educated people will believe in educating their children, isn't it? So if they have a higher income, then they will educate more, right? It will facilitate them educating their children rather than when they have low incomes, right? Then tastes and preferences, like we're looking at the factors that affect demand for goods and services, right? In our economics, yeah. Of course, we looked at tastes, for some of you anyway, that we had the chance to study some economics. We looked at the tastes and preferences, right? So the tastes of and preferences for education, of course, as a demanded good, we find that some people are not interested. They don't really take education as serious, whereas others take it serious. So these tastes and preferences for education by households will determine on whether they educate the children or whether they go to school or not. Then demographic characteristics such as fertility and mortality, right? So fertility has to do with, especially here in Africa, where we have People believe so much in giving birth to many kids. And of course, that has an economic consequence, isn't it? An economic repercussion, of course, keeping other factors constant. When you have like 20 kids, just imagine someone has 10 children in this era, right? The kind of economic challenges they will go through in terms of educating their children, given that it is even becoming costly to educate children, right? So of course that one will have an impact there. Mortality, we are looking at the death rates. Of course, keeping other factors constant, if the death rates are high, then we are expecting even the education to deteriorate. Then direct cost on education, of course, we know that this one would actually be in terms of price of education, right? Direct costs on education, of course, the charges that the charges for this education, right? Whether at university, primary or secondary level, will determine whether people are interested, whether people are going to be educated or not. If it's costly, then of course it's going to discourage people. And if it's affordable, of course, more people will be able to go to school and also educate their children. Then students grants, availability of students grants, of course, keeping other factors constant. If these grants are availed, then students will be able to get free education, and this will increase the level of educated citizens. Then existing standard of admission to various levels of education. So regarding on whether it is the complexity, right? Some of these institutions, it could be primary, by the way, level, it could be secondary or even university level, where some of these universities have too many complexities. They're like, if you have not got these points, if you have not performed this well, you will not be admitted to this university. So even that complexity determines on how many people are going to be enrolled for that kind of education at that kind of education level, right? So those are the factors affecting the demand for education, given that education should be looked at as a good that is demanded, right? So we were looking at the social demand approach, which I think I did not explain in detail. The social demand approach here, we are looking at that it assumes that society looks at education as a good that is demanded, and depending on how on the importance that these individuals attach to education, it will determine the number of it will determine the level of individuals that are taking on the education. Then the rate of return approach to education planning. So with this rate of return approach to education planning, it looks at education as an investment. It looks at education as an investment, and that when you invest in education, there is that rate of return that is attained at the end of the day. I believe some of us have studied some financial management, where they have taught us to calculate all those what are they called? What I know, the little I know is that, is it called internal rate of return? It is that rate of return where the NPV is 0, right? The net present value is 0. Okay, that is the little I know, but they have taught you to calculate all those, the present value, is it future value. So this kind of theory here, it will even go ahead to calculate, to use those calculations of yours in financial management, where they will calculate the rate of return on education. Remember that these ones, these rates of return are calculated, of course, to see the viability of the project. Yes. So in this perspective here, it will be different, for example, different sectors of the economy here, where education is one of the sectors. And these calculations will actually be taken to see whether it is viable to invest in the education sector. So there are basically three parameters involved in estimation of this rate of return to education planning. And here we use the costs of education, how the charges of this education. We use the return on education, and then we use the discounted rate, where we shall basically, the discount, there is discounting of future returns to arrive at present value. So at the end of the day, you'll be able to, depending on the figures that you would have got, you will be able to know whether it is viable, it is financially viable to invest in the education sector. So that is the rate of return approach on investment, on education planning. So what are the limitations of rate of return approach, right? Number one is that it is only applicable to relative policies. In other words, policies that are in favor of supporting the education sector, right? That are in favor of investing in the education sector. Then it does not facilitate value judgment among different projects in the priority ordering. Of course, when you are doing this financial analysis, you're looking at different projects. Here we are looking at, of course, different sectors to invest in. And of course, here, this rate of return approach to education planning, of course, it is biased towards investing in education, right? Because it looks at education as an that investing in education earns the rate of return with it, right? So it is biased towards education and leaves out or neglects or ignores other projects or other sectors of the economy, right? So also there is a challenge of determining how much to invest in this education sector using this rate of return approach to education planning, right? Of course, now we are looking at, it's the government now doing all this. Are we on the right track? It is the government now doing this, whether to invest in the education sector or not. But the question would be, after you have found out that it's viable maybe to invest in the education sector, how much now should be, the question is on how much should be invested, how much should be invested in the education sector is also another question that needs to be answered for this rate of return approach. Then this rate of return approach does not take into consideration the supply and demand of skills in the labor market. So it's one thing, this theory assumes that if you invest in education, there is a rate of return. There is a rate of return on investing in that education. But at the end of the day, after you've invested in education, you've educated the people, you've provided scholarship to these people, and they've graduated. At the end of the day, the labor market, the forces of demand and supply in the labor market will determine how many people the forces of demand and supply in the labor market are the ones that are going to determine how many people are employed and how many are not employed. Of course, when we realize that the labor supply is greater than the labor demand, then we are going to have a lot of people that are unemployed or that cannot find jobs, right? So that is also a limitation to that rate of return approach to education planning. And then also to economists, they look at this rate of return approach to education planning as simply a screening tool, So practically, it's one thing to educate citizens, but it's also another for this education to really contribute to the human capital formation, whereby, in other words, to contribute to different sectors of the economy, because you may find that these people are educated, but they don't have the skills to work in these different sectors. Then let's look at the manpower requirement approach. The manpower requirement approach. This approach assumes that, of course, it's an approach to human resource planning. It assumes that there is a positive link, there is a definite link between education and economic growth. In other words, there is a positive relationship between education and economic growth. In other words, increase in education levels lead to increase in economic growth. And here, increase in economic growth will be looked at, in terms of what we call the gross national product, GNP. And the gross national product is simply the national income. It is simply the national income. And with national income here, we are looking at the monetary value of final goods and services that are produced in a country, right? So, of course, with there is what we call GDP and GNP. I don't want to take you in economics, but of course, sometimes we need to know some of these concepts, GDP and GNP. Who knows the difference? GDP and GNP. Of course, GDP is used mostly. Anyone who knows the difference? Yes?
Yeah, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Yes, GDP is basically the monetary value of all goods and services produced within a country, within its boundaries.
Which one?
GDP,
Which one?
GDP.
GDP.
Yes, looks at the value of goods and services produced within a country.
GDP.
Yes, then GNP is basically the value of goods and services produced within a country and other incomes earned by people staying out but are from a given country. It basically gets GDP plus any other incomes earned by foreign nationals.
All right, that is good. So GDP, domestic, right? Gross domestic, that one is within, if it's like Uganda, it's within Uganda. Are we together? So if it's GDP, it's within, if it's in Uganda, it will be within Uganda. So if it will consider even the non-Ugandans, GDP, it will be in the national income within the country's borders. So it will consider the Ugandans and the non-Ugandans for GDP. But for GNP, it will consider the Ugandans. gross national. It will consider the national income within Uganda, and also for the Ugandans that are outside, that are abroad. Are we together? But because this one is the GNP is hard, how can you determine now the national income for Ugandans that are elsewhere in the world? It's difficult. So that's why they use the GDP, which considers in the national income in the country. So this manpower requirement approach to education planning, for it assumes that there is a positive relationship between education and economic growth. If there is increase in education, even economic growth will increase. But the economic growth will be in terms of the national income, specifically gross national product, right? Or specified target of industrial production, right? All right. So basically here, the planners, what the planners do to indicate directions of development of the education sector, how will they know that there is development in the education sector? They use these different steps. Number one is that they will anticipate the directions and the magnitude of development for each individual sectors of the economy. And of course here they will be looking at different sectors of the contribution of national income by different sectors of the economy, where they will realize maybe a particular sector, maybe the education sector, is contributing too much, more than other sectors in terms of contributing the national income. Maybe it could be that if the government invested more in the education sector, and at the end of the day, it is getting, like we've looked at the rate of return approach of education planning, and at the end of the day, it is the educated people that are becoming entrepreneurs, that are becoming employed and contributing to taxes towards government. Then it will know that there is development, right, of the education sector. Are we together? Then another step that these planners will do is to employ manpower in each individual sector, keeping view of the technological options. So they will get these educated people, and they will make sure that these people they get jobs for these educated citizens to work in these different sectors of the economy. Of course, they know that as these people work in these different sectors, at the end of the day, they will have to pay what? Taxes, right? They'll have to pay as you earn, right? To the government. And of course, this leads to economic growth. Then also, these planners will translate the physical targets for the development of each individual sector into the manpower requirements. So practically what they will be doing is that to ensure that these different sectors are to invest in these different sectors of the economy. Of course, not only the education sector, but for example, health, agriculture sector, the manufacturing sector, right? Construction sector, all those ones, to invest in them. And as long as they know that at the end of the day, these sectors will be able to employ these educated citizens, then it will lead to economic development. Of course, we know that economic development is broader than economic growth, right? Economic development is broader than economic growth. Economic growth will only look at the GDP figures, the national income figures and stop there. But economic development will not only look at the national income figures, but it will go ahead to look at the welfare of the citizens, the welfare of the citizens in terms of access to health services, in terms of the literacy levels, in terms of the life expectancy, all those ones. Economic development considers not only national income figures, but also the welfare of the citizens in terms of, for example, in terms of the literacy levels, in terms of access to health services, and so on. So these planners also, in order to know that there is development, the magnitude of development of the education sector, they will also go ahead to look at the enrollment rates, yeah? They'll look at the enrollment rates, the stagnation rates, for example. Of course, when you see that the enrollment rates are increasing, you know that there is the education sector is developing, contrary to when these enrollment rates, of course, the enrollment to education, right, are decreasing. Limitations of the manpower requirement approach. So we've seen that the manpower requirement approach shows a positive relationship between, or a direct relationship between, education and economic growth, right? So it looks at it looks at the what I would call the human resource, right? In terms of labor, in terms of provision of labor by these human beings, but it does not look consider the fact that even machines can be used in these factory, in these industries, for example. So these human beings, these educated human beings, or these educated citizens, can be replaced with machines. So that is the limitation of, that's one of the limitation of this approach of manpower requirement, of course, to education planning. So it is very possible that people are educated and they have the skills, but even the machines are substituting. And of course, reducing, leading to employment, increasing unemployment levels. Then the second limitation of this manpower requirement approach to education planning is that it also, it looks at a positive, a direct, a definite link, or a positive relationship between the industrial task and education level. So, for example, it's like we've seen that it is one thing to have to be educated and have the qualifications, but it's also another thing to have the skills, to have the required skills that are, for example, needed in these industries, right? So you may have the papers, but you lack the required skills that are needed in these industries. That is also a limitation of this manpower requirement approach to education planning. And then lastly, it also has a limitation of only looking at formal education and training, right?
Okay. Better question.
Only looks at formal education. The kind of formal education that we are looking at is this kind of education we are having here, right? Where we are trained to you know, we are training people to have careers, isn't it? So we have trained people that, you know, if you want to be a doctor, you have to do this course and the other course. We have trained people, if you want to be a lawyer, you have to do this course and this course, that kind of thing. That is the formal education. So practically, this manpower requirement approach to education planning ignores informal education. It ignores what? Formal education. And remember that with this kind of, some of this kind of informal education, it's where people get the skills. It's where these people get the skills practically. So that is also a limitation of this manpower requirement approach to education planning. It ignores informal education, where in some cases it is this informal education that provides the skills to the citizens. So let us look at the human resource planning process. The human resource planning process. So the human resource planning process, basically, it is aimed at matching the skills, knowledge, and behavior, right? With matching these skills with the rightful positions or tasks. So with the human resource planning process, it basically involves looking at the internal and the external environment, right? That will affect the current and future workforce. And also it involves linking the human resources strategies with the business outcomes. In other words, what is the business thinking ahead of the human resource needs? And how is it going to help the organization achieve its goals? And also, this human resource planning process aims at financial and human capital management, managing of these employees, right? It helps in strategies of financial and human capital management. So an ideal human resource planning system should have the following. It should put into consideration the following. It should be holistic in its approach. In other words, holistic means here we mean that it should link its planning strategies with the budget process. In other words, as the business, as the organization is planning for its human resource needs, it should also consider its budget. You should consider your pocket as an organization. Don't just wake up one morning and you're like, you know, we need to recruit, right? But the recruitment, the selection, it involves costs. So at the end of the day, is it cost effective for you to recruit more people? Will you be able to pay them, right? And then it should, this human resource planning system, it should build around service needs and skills. So it should build along attaining the rightful skills that are needed, but that the rightful skills that these prospective employees to be employed have, And will these skills be able to help the organization improve its quality of service or the quality of products? So as the organizations are thinking ahead of their human resource needs, at the end of the day, the question should be, will this be able to help the people with the right full skills? If they are good, will they help in delivery of the quality service of quality products? Then it should be flexible, to change in regard to the economic, technological, political, and environmental factors. And then this human resource planning system should also put into consideration, it should consider continual learning and development concepts, especially here in terms of the human capital, right? Allowing the employees to continually learn and developing these employees in form of, for example, training them and empowering them, capacity building. Then finally, the human resource planning system should be data driven, right? Data driven. So it's very important that as organizations plan, they should also have the data, the relevant data that they should be using to allow. We are going to realize that there are a number of techniques, for example, forecasting techniques that are used, and some of them actually this data in regard to the human resource department, it will be used to actually make the forecasting, which will help in planning accordingly. So the human resource planning process has 5 phases. It has 5 phases. Number 1, the first phase is to analyze, right? Analyzing. This basically involves gathering human resource information that is needed. The second stage is forecasting. Forecasting that will basically involve demand versus the supply analysis for labor. And then planning. The third phase of human resource planning is planning, which is practically identifying the strategy to use, and then implementing is putting into practice the strategy, and then evaluating is basically getting feedback on how effective the human resource planning process has been, right? So let's begin with the first phase of the human resource planning process, which is analyzing. So the first phase of the human resource planning process is analyzing, and the analyzing here, it will involve gathering information about the internal demand factors and the external supply factors, right? So here, basically what the organization needs to know is that, is there any demand for labor, any more like need for more laborers in an organization? That should be a question that this organization should be able to answer. And if there is any demand for labor, any more demand for labor by an organization, the question would be where to get that supply, where to get the labor, the people with the required skills, right? So it is practically a demand supply analysis. So in this first stage of analyzing, which is the first stage of the human resource planning process, here we are basically looking for gathering information, right? Demand supply analysis, and the demand for labor here, it will be guided by the following factors. Well, we shall look at, the organization will look at its strategic plan. Yeah, of course, if it has a strategic plan on what it's intending to have in future, maybe the next 5 years, you might find that within its strategic plan, it is maybe planning to expand, right? In terms of maybe opening up other branches, right? So in that perspective, it will require to recruit more employees in future. Then internal or external reports that could affect business outcomes. So with the internal reports, practically here, they could be financial reports, right? Financial reports, but of course these ones give they tell a story. They tell a financial story on how the business is faring financially, right? So if the business is not doing well financially, why should you think of recruiting more, of increasing on the size of the human capital? Budget estimates, right? So we've seen that a holistic human resource planning system should put across the strategies of the business in line with the budget estimate. So even as an organization, consider your pocket before thinking ahead of maybe increasing the human capital for the business or employing more workers, right? So even the budget estimate will determine on whether you could find that the organization has the capacity to employ more workers. Of course, we are going to see why, some of the reasons why. Then you can look at, the organization can look at plans for new technology. So of course here, if the organization has plans of bringing in new technology, for example, in form of new machinery, it would require that as long as it has brought in the new machinery, it will require to recruit people that have the relevant skills to operate that machinery, those machines, right? So it should also be thinking ahead in terms of recruiting such skillful people to handle those machines. Then the organization should also look at employee survey information. Employee survey information here, it will require the organization, for example, using questionnaires to for these employees within the organization to fill, right? So as long as the employees within the organization have filled in the questionnaire, then this will be analyzed, of course, to come up with what is happening what is happening in the organization, and this will help it to determine the human resource needs and whether to plan ahead of the human resource needs or not. Also looking at the external contract services. external contract services. So of course, here it will be in terms of comparing what other organizations are offering these would be offering these employees, because we've seen scenarios where if they are better, if other organizations, for example, rival firms, are offering better employment offers, right? Employment offers, then it will of course attract these employees of your organization to go there because they are looking for greener pastures, right? We've seen some of these employees on some in some companies being, I don't know whether it's called stealing, yeah, being stolen by other, in quotes, by other rival companies. So there it means that your competitors are better off in terms of the employment contract offers that they are providing. Then looking at the organization culture, of course, every organization has its way of doing things. So it could be in the organization culture that it is not really in line of employing more people in future, right? It doesn't regularly recruit or think ahead of increasing the human capital. Then changing competences. Here we are seeing that with competences, we are looking at the human capital, the employees, that of course, as the world changes, as the world changes with different factors like changing technology, we know that even human capital has to adjust. So at the end of the day, you will find that the organization will need to plan ahead, and will need, for example, to recruit in the future, especially people with those competences or with those required skills that are ever changing. Then also the organization has to look at the environmental factors, which are basically in the form of political expectations. You know that politics has a lot to do with the determining human resource planning. We've already looked at that. We've looked at the PESTEL, yeah, the political, economic, social, environmental, and legal factors. The organization also have to look at demographic changes. We've looked at that in terms of age, sex, literacy levels. And also it has to consider influence of technology. We've already looked at that with the ever-changing technology, it also requires a planning ahead, for example, to recruit people with the relevant skills to handle, for example, different, the incoming new, for example, technology in form of machinery. Then changes in economic forecasting. So you may find that initially the economic forecasting might have been done, but it's not really bringing out the clear picture. And you may need maybe at the end of the day, what was forecast may not really come to pass, but you may need, maybe it was forecast that you may not need to recruit more employees, but at the end of the day, you find that the forecast has changed and you need to recruit more. Then the organization should also look at current and future level of accountability, right? So of course, at the end of the day, the cost benefit analysis has to be made to ensure whether this will be cost effective. That was about resources and the factors that the organization should put into consideration while analyzing the information that is required, that should be used in this human resource planning process. Then we look at the supply analysis, where the organization will also look at the internal and the external factors. So with the internal supply of factors, the organization will look at age and gender distribution that we've already looked at. We've looked at retirement rates, for example. We've looked at what you call female, they're called equal opportunity, what? Employment opportunities, yeah? Where even the females are, some governments ensure that that there is equal distribution, yeah? In terms of employment for the females and the males. Retirement rates also that should be looked at or considered. For example, we saw the need for human resource planning, that if the retirement rates have reached for these internal employees of yours, you should think ahead who is going to replace these retired employees, location of the workplace. So location of the workplace has a lot to do with determining how many determining the success of people joining your company or your organization, because you may find the organization or the company is, or the business is located in a remote area, and most people are not interested in working with the with the companies that are in remote areas or in villages. Diversity characteristics. So with the diversity characteristics here, we are looking at companies that are thinking about expanding diversification, right? Expanding, maybe they want to do different other businesses within the same organizations to produce other products, other differentiated products, maybe other totally different businesses, but for the same company. Of course, there it means that there will be more need, increased need for human increased need for recruiting more human capital. So that will see the need for human resource planning. The length of service. So the length of service, you find that, of course, if it is, I'm looking at it in the perspective of private sector, right? Let us look at it in the perspective of, I don't know whether there are some of us working for the government, but I'm looking at it more in the perspective of the private sector. Length of service, is it contractual, right? Of course, with the private sector, it can never be permanent employment. Of course, if the contract is 5 years, then you know that at the end of, at least by the end of the 50th year or the beginning of the 50th year, you should be able to plan ahead, because these people's contracts will be expiring and you will need to recruit. Resignation rates. So if the employees within an organization are resigning day and night, right? Ask yourself as an employer, why are they resigning? Right? Why are they resigning? So if they are resigning day and night, then of course you have no option but to think ahead of planning for the human resource needs, and then of course you need to recruit employees to replace those ones that have resigned. Internal career paths, right? So with internal career paths, of course, we've seen that promotions are needed, where people need to develop their careers within an organization. So also that should be considered. Then still under supply analysis, external factors here, we look at the labor trends, of course, in the labor market, right? The labor trends, how is the supply and demand for labor, supply versus demand for labor in the labor market. Then we look at internal versus external acceptance rates. Of course, here you're looking at the acceptance rates could be in terms of the terms of employment, right? The terms of employment, in terms of your organization versus other organizations. So that was the first step of human resource planning process, which was analyzing. And basically the analyzing was the demand and supply analysis of labor. The second stage of human resource planning is forecasting. So here we shall be forecasting the demand for labor versus the supply for labor. And the forecasting here has 4 steps. It has 4 steps, and these four steps are identifying key cost assumptions, validating these assumptions, utilizing assumptions for scenario, and building and performing the gap analysis. All right. So of course, with the forecasting, we are going to use what you call the SWOT analysis and the PESO or the PESTEL analysis. I don't know if we have come across those acronyms. I believe for some of us that have done strategic management or even marketing, we have come across those acronyms, the SWOT, strength, weakness, opportunity, and threat. And then the PESO, political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental or ecological analysis. So the PESO analysis basically will be for the external analysis, external factors that affect actually the human resource planning process. And then for the SWOT analysis, it will be basically the SWOT is the strength, weakness, opportunity, and threat, where the strength, weakness will be for the internal factors of the organization, and the opportunity and the threat will be for the external factors of the organization. So using the SWOT analysis helps the organization to identify its gaps, where it is lacking, where it has not perfected itself, to identify the gap analysis. Of course, some of the gaps that could be identified is that you could realize that the organization is lacking employees with the relevant skills, with the appropriate skills, right? That one could be the gap that you have identified using the SWOT and the PESTEL analysis. So let's look at the techniques of forecasting. The techniques of forecasting, we have a number of them that are often used. Number one, we have the trend analysis, So with the trend analysis here, the organization will be using its historical data. It's historical data concerning human resources, right? Concerning the employment levels. For example, it could be like, for example, for the last 5 years or for the last 10 years, you look at the employment statistics for each year and you realize that, for example, for the last 5 years, the employment levels has been increasing by 5% annually, 5% annually. So there you'll be able to focus that even in the next year, the employment rate will be 5%. Even in the next year, the employment rate will be 5%. So that is the trend analysis, basically, where organizations will be using historical data concerning employment levels. Then we have the ratio analysis method of forecasting. That one with the ratio analysis, it will involve setting up a relationship between two variables, between one variable and another variable. It could be setting up the relationship between productivity and the number of employees. Productivity and the number of employees. You could find that, for example, if it takes 5 employees, right? If it takes 5 employees to produce 100,000 units of a product, if it takes 5 employees to produce 100,000 units of a product, then definitely it means that if output increased, or if productivity increased to 1 million units per year, then it will require, we just multiply by 10, because here it will require now 50 employees. Are we together? It will require now 50 employees to actually to help generate that output. So that is the ratio analysis, whereby, for example, we can look at increase in production levels vis-a-vis the employees. Are we together? We are looking at production levels or output levels vis-a-vis the number of employees. How many employees does it take to produce a given amount of output? So if the output increases, then you will know that even the number of employees will increase by this much. So that is the ratio analysis of method of forecasting turnover method of forecasting, right? So if, for example, we say that the turnover rate for, if we say the turnover rate for an organization is high, then it means people are leaving the rate at which people are leaving the organization is high. People are over, if it is resigning, people are over resigning, yeah? If we say the turnover rate is high, that's what it means. So here, the organization will look at the trends, the rate at which people are resigning, yeah? Maybe for the past 5 years, you realize people have been over resigning. Every year, at least 5 people resign. Then you know that even next year, 5 people will resign. So you're basically looking at the way people are resigning, the way people are absconding from work, that kind of thing, right? To help you forecast. And of course, if you focus that they'll even next year 5 people will resign, then you have to plan ahead of recruiting more people. But also you should ask yourself as an employer, why are they resigning? Are the working conditions okay? Because you leave and employ others and they will also resign, right? So we are still looking at the methods of forecasting, which is our second phase of the human resource learning process. Another type of forecasting, another way of forecasting is nominal group technique. Nominal group technique, where with the nominal group technique, the forecast is made, we get a group of employees who come, or a group of members, yeah? In an organization, everyone makes a forecast. Of course, they are making a demand forecast, yeah? They're making a forecast on whether they will need to employ more people, or whether they will not need to employ more people, right? So each member in an organization makes a forecast, and then at the end of the day, they will present these forecasts are discussed to come up with the final forecast. Delphi method, the Delphi technique of forecasting. When we talk about Delphi, we are talking about experts, right? So with Delphi technique of forecasting here, the organization is making forecasts practically by using experts, right? So these experts will make forecasts, yeah, for you as an organization, but these experts are not in the same place. And thereafter, these forecasts will be put together and come up with a group consensus that is reached to come up with the final forecast. Groupthink technique of forecasting here. A group of people here, of course, within an organization here, they will come up with they'll work together, and they'll come to a consensus of the final forecast. Managerial judgment. Here it will be basically the top level managers, for example, making the forecasts, yeah? Making the forecasts, managerial judgment. The top level managers here are forecasting, right? All right. So they focused on the need for employment, the needed employment levels. So we have the managerial judgment here. Important for us to notice there are two. We can have a top level forecast and a bottom up forecast, yeah? So top level forecast is where the top level managers are forecasting about the employment needs, right, for the organization. And with the bottom up forecast here, various departments in an organization are coming up, the various departments are providing an idea of the required workforce for these departments, right? The departments are providing information on whether these departments need to recruit or not. That is the bottom up forecast. Statistical forecasts. So with the statistical forecast still here, we are using data. We are using time series data, where we are using historical data for a number of years backwards, like it could be 10 years or more. And here we are using statistical methods like using regression analysis to develop these forecasts. Economists use these statistical forecasts where they look at trends to make, we use those ones to make policies. Then computer modeling. Here we are using computers and the sophisticated, so organizations are using computers and sophisticated softwares to make these forecasts, right? All right, of course, the data will be needed, the organization data in terms of employment information will be used, employment information will be used to make these forecasts using these sophisticated computer softwares. Multiple methods is where we are using one or more of these forecast methods. So how to determine internal and external supply of employees, how to determine internal and external supply of employees. For internal supply, determining the internal supply of employees, we use a number of methods. We can use replacement charts, where here it literally requires just making records of which employees are currently working and those ones that need to be promoted, right? So who needs to replace the other in the position, succession, that's determination of internal supply of labor. Succession planning here, this one happens mostly high-level positions where, for example, if the managing director is about to leave, people will be thinking about who is going to succeed, who is going now to stand in the shoes of who? Of the managing director. That is succession planning. Then human resource management information systems. These ones also can be used. They can be used, of course, using the available database of employment information about, of course, every employee you have information about yourself. So this one will be used for each employee in an organization, but using the human resource, will be analyzed using the human resource management information system that will be able to assist the organization determining the rightful employee within an organization with the rightful skills to take over the positions, the vacant positions, departmental estimates. So as departments, of course, we've looked at this as the bottom-up approach of forecasting, where we see that these departments will be able to avail information on whether they need to recruit more employees in their departments, right? All right, so that was the second phase of the human resource planning process. Remember, our first stage was analyzing, which was basically the supply and the demand and supply analysis of labor. The second stage we've been looking at of human resource planning process has been the forecasting phase. And the third stage is the planning. The planning stage, where basically we are identifying the strategy. So we are identifying the strategy here, and we are also ensuring the elements that we shall recruit, develop, and retain the critical staff, right? So here we plan that we are going to recruit, we plan that we shall, we basically put down a blueprint of what is going to be done. That is the planning strategy. The fourth phase of human resource planning process is the implementation. Now is the putting into practice. So it was forecast that if it was forecast that you will need to recruit more employees, then here you are literally now doing the recruitment and selection process that we looked at in our previous class. And then after you've recruited and selected the relevant employees with the relevant skills to fill the rightful positions, you will have to evaluate. And the evaluation will mean that have you been able to meet the people that you've recruited? Have they been able to help the organization meet its goals? Have they been the rightful people with the rightful skills, right? So until next time, Our class ends here. See you.